So why did the government of Israel agree to a ceasefire with Hezbollah, but not with Hamas? We're going to go through a couple videos that I think really give essential background into this conflict, into the parties of this conflict, and explain why I think Hezbollah was able to reach a ceasefire with Israel, but Hamas was not. And we're going to go through 5 reasons why that is right now. Point number 1, there's an immense economic toll on Israel from prosecuting a year of war against Hamas and against Hezbollah. So the economic consequences of their reservists being on duty away from contributing to the private sector and their economy and essentially being soldiers, combined with the economic consequences of the displacement of Israeli people in northern Israel, has incurred a big cost on the country. And it's only gotten worse as time has gone. It's been a year of this conflict. The second point is that military casualties on an army like the IDF have an outsized impact. So military casualties affect different militaries in different ways, depending on how big their population is, how big their military is, lots of factors. But really what we can say is that the IDF is a casualty phobic army. Think of it as like the exact opposite of Russia's army. Whereas we've seen in the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia will just expend, hundreds, thousands of soldiers, of their own soldiers, and sort of meat wave tactics. Think of Israel and the IDF as the complete opposite of that. They definitely follow the United States sort of recipe for war, which is air power and artillery and essentially throwing money at the problem. And it's not their own money; it's the United States' money. But they don't like to expend their own people's lives, their soldiers' lives. So they're extremely casualty phobic. Third point is that Lebanon, unlike Palestine, has diplomatic sovereignty. So they have, actual standing in the UN, in the Court of Public Opinion as a sovereign nation. So Israel cannot violate their sovereignty to the same degree that they can for Palestinian people. Point number 4 is that you agree to a ceasefire because you feel that you have actually garnered a position of strength. And so the IDF can actually claim some form of victory in this conflict with Hezbollah. And some would argue that they could also claim that with Hamas, but we'll get into some of the differences between those two theaters of this conflict to explain why. And then point number 5 is really sort of summarizes everything because it's essentially this sort of ceasefire, this sort of victory is essentially all that Israel can really hope for in a conflict with Hezbollah. It's been this way many other times. They had a war in the 80s. They had the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, both of which we're going to sort of go into, and both of which have... there's videos that I'm going to link and review a little bit in this video that I highly recommend everybody goes and looks at. But essentially, the complete victory is just completely out of reach. It would be far too costly for the IDF and for Israel. So this is essentially the best that they can get. It also is essentially the best that Hezbollah can get. So that's why they've agreed to this. Even though they're both breaking the ceasefire already, this is essentially what they both want and what they can get. All right, so point number 1, the economic consequences of a year of war.
More than 60,000 Israeli businesses are expected to go bankrupt in the coming months. Tourism has ground to a halt, and consumption, trade and foreign investment have all slumped. Israel's war on Gaza is damaging almost every sector of its economy. That says spending and borrowing are both rocketing to finance the mounting cost of the war. The cost is expected to reach more than $67 billion by next year. Credit rating agencies have downgraded Israel for the first time in its history. And many Israeli economists are warning the nation will face a financial crisis if it fails to act.
So this video was published back in September 12th. So this was, I think, right before the ground invasion of Lebanon. So this is what I mean when like a two-front war. I mean, the war in Gaza is still happening and still costing a lot of money. A two-front war is just like, it's like ballooning their costs to the point where this is why they needed to reach that ceasefire pretty soon. So as soon as they achieved like some goals, some of their war aims, they needed to like wrap it up as fast as possible. If it wasn't for the hostages, I think that would have happened also with the war against Hamas since October 7th. The reason why they haven't done, a ceasefire like that with Hamas, I mean, there's a lot of political reasons, specific to Netanyahu, the Likud government. But one of the biggest reasons, of course, is that Hamas took hundreds of hostages as bargaining chips. And so that really delayed, Israel's ability, really stymied Israel's ability to make a quick, decisive victory so that they could, mitigate some of those economic costs. So they were able to achieve a little bit of that against Hezbollah. And so, that's why we're seeing that, what we're seeing now.
On a shaky ground, after 11 months on a war footing, Israel's economy is experiencing its slowest growth of recent times. In the fourth quarter of last year, it contracted by almost 21%. And the finance ministry has slashed its growth prediction for this year from 1.9% to 1.1%. Credit rating agencies have downgraded Israel's status by a notch.
So this is already a recession.
Its fiscal deficit could reach
2 quarters of contraction.
7.8% this year,
We're going to contract
from
next year too.
4.1% in 2023. The agency also expects debt to remain above 70% of GDP in the medium term.
For context, like other countries like Russia, who are prosecuting, a huge war in Ukraine, their debt to GDP ratio is much better than Israel's, and obviously much better than the United States' debt to GDP ratio as well.
But say the change in Israel's credit rating will have an impact on government finances.
It will make bonds that Israel sell to finance government expanding more expensive. Okay, it will have to pay higher interest rate for those people who buy these bonds, because the bond will be riskier. Okay, so the government will have it harder to raise money in the international market.
Almost every sector of the Israeli economy has been affected by the war, with the construction industry one of the hardest hit. Israel has expelled more than 140,000
Palestinians worked in construction in
since
Israel.
October.
In this construction site, there's about 230 people. About 70 people left since the war started.
This guy's a
Since
Chinese
the start of the war,
migrant worker.
Israel doesn't allow Palestinians to work here. There's a huge lack of workforce.
Experts are warning that the longer the war drags on, the less likely it is that the economy will get back on its feet quickly.
We'll be stubborn and continue the war until I don't know what. Then I think we will not recover.
So here, like this article from the New York Times was published 10 months ago. So this is when they were only waging a war against Hamas. I mean, against Hezbollah too, but no ground invasion yet. So in 2023, it says this about 20% of the Israeli workforce was missing from the labor market, from 3%. So a change from 3% before the fighting began up to 20%, which is a ridiculous, like that's an insane change for a country that's so small. So this really just hammers home the point that, like, despite the fact that Israel, is well positioned for war, they're very aggressively positioned. It's just so costly for them. I mean, it's even ironic. It's crazy. Just like the labor shortages have been particularly acute in the tourism, construction, and agriculture sectors. The latter two industries rely heavily on Palestinian workers that have been largely barred from entering Israel since October 7th. So it's like they're having it's like a recipe for economic disaster, right? You have people who, like 60,000 businesses that are bankrupt because soldiers or reservists are entrepreneurs, so their businesses are essentially collapsing. You have increased economic strain on financial incentives for not incentives, but like back pay for those reservists, financial aid essentially. And then you have their economy is then stagnating because, two of their economic sectors rely heavily on Palestinian labor or on foreign labor. And no one's going to come work inside your country when it's being under threat of missile attack and when it's, in the midst of a two-front war, especially when your country's the size of New Jersey. So it really cannot be overstated that that this is the principal reason why they're arriving at a ceasefire right now. Even if the ceasefire is not perfect, they're gonna stick to it. Mark, I'm sure they're gonna stick with it. Just another point on this first point, the economic point. This New York Times article from June of this year makes some pretty good points about the human element of this economic burden. So obviously when a war like this happens, it's the same case in Ukraine, it's the same case in any other country that, like 9/11 in the United States, you have this surge of patriotism, of support, popular support amongst the citizenry, and that just starts to wane over time. So you have 12, 13 months of war in Israel. A lot of these reservists, a lot of the people in the citizenry, I mean, obviously they're doing protests against the government because of specific things like the hostages and Netanyahu's corruption and all that notwithstanding, their support for the war is waning. And you're talking about a country where like hundreds of thousands, like huge significant parts of the population are dual citizens. Like these are people who can leave and will leave if their economic prospects are not even like okay in the country that they call home. I mean, they are dual citizens, majority in the United States. They're Russian dual citizens, Ukrainian. Obviously, that's a whole. You'd be leaving one war zone to another. But there's many dual citizens, and they actually do have options. And so you're talking about like, high growth sectors in Israel, like in tech, things that they're really good at. Their economies is responsible for a lot of economic prosperity in Israel. That's all really centered on human capital and capital flight in the form of people, in the form of money. It's happening at a rapid rate. So, things like insurance. I mean, insurance rates in Israel must be insane, especially after a war like this. Just for anything. I mean, what is the insurance premium for rocket attacks? I mean, who knows? So, that's another key component. It's not just about, deficits, expenditures, economic slowdown. It's also like all these compounding factors that don't just immediately go away just because a ceasefire is happening. So they didn't just need a ceasefire because they needed to stop the economic bleeding now. They need a ceasefire because the longer the war goes on, the longer, the ripple effects are going to continue. These sets of issues also, overlap with other issues. So there's a big issue in Israel about Orthodox people, ultra-Orthodox citizens who are exempt from the military conscription, and they may not be exempt from the military conscription. It says right here, like, last month, the recently formed Economist Forum released an open letter warning that if the ultra-Orthodox issue isn't dealt with, Israel risks a spiral of collapse as more and more secular people give up and leave the country. I mean, so it's like if you think of it from the perspective of a normal, I shouldn't say normal, of a typical Israeli, you're a reservist, you're always at risk of being deployed for a war, whether it's in Gaza, I guaranteed every 10 years, essentially. And you have dual citizenship, you're educated, and the people who vote in, a very aggressive right-wing Likud government, many of them, or I should say a minority of them, are ideologically aggressive, and like hawkish, but exempt from military service. I mean, just you can imagine someone in that scenario would say, like, this is getting out of control. You're trying to get an education, form a career, form a family, and you have options. It's just not a good situation. So I think a spiral of collapse is a good way of describing that. So we need to move on to the second point: military casualties and the casualty phobic nature of the IDF. We're just going to watch a short clip of a video published a while ago by the YouTube channel Task and Purpose. Highly recommend. About the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. For context, and it's going to really demonstrate, because essentially the same issues that Israel's having now in their ground invasion of Lebanon are the same issues that, you know, they had in that 2006 war, even though they're more successful now than they were then. But we're going to get to those details.
I want to talk to you about something difficult today, the 2006 Israeli-Lebanon war, because its unresolved threads continue to influence the region to this day. We'll see how the outcome of this war has changed how both sides might approach a future conflict. This is Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. When he came to power in 1999, Israel had already been occupying southern Lebanon for over a decade. He was Israel's highest decorated soldier, with 35 years experience, so he had some perspective on military strategy. The IDF controlled 10% of Lebanon in what they called a security zone. It was meant to protect northern Israel from a long history of attacks from various armed factions, and yet according to Barak, it was no longer having the desired effect.
So, I mean, one has to it begs the question, why aren't they doing this sort of occupation or security zone again? Because right now the ceasefire has them pulling back, the IDF pulling back all the way to the international border. So, I mean, obviously, if they thought that they could handle that, either, you know, that cost was worth it, that's what they would be doing. It also could be that Hezbollah just like had enough leverage where they would not agree to a ceasefire where Israel occupied any Lebanese territory.
There were increasing Israeli casualties and frequent rocket attacks continued. There appeared to be no clear military victory in sight. On top of all this, there was growing international pressure mounting for Barak to comply with UN Security Council Resolution 425. This resolution called for Israel to withdraw to the internationally recognized border. Ehud Barak took a long, hard look at the guerrilla war that was being waged against him in southern Lebanon, and he assessed
international pressure
that the ongoing conflict with Hezbollah wasn't yielding any strategic benefit for Israel anymore. So in May 2000, Barak's government ordered the withdrawal of IDF forces. But this withdrawal had the effect of making Hezbollah's popularity soar among the public in Lebanon. Reports indicate Commander Halutz convinced the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense of his standalone air campaign strategy, even though there was skepticism of the plan. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force, the IAF, and a small Special Forces ground raid began hitting Hezbollah targets across the border. But Hezbollah had already planned for this exact response and dispersed their rocket teams across the open countryside. This move avoided taking heavy losses. Israel would fly 15,000 air sorties and hit 7,000 targets throughout the war, but the missions did little to stop the pace of incoming rocket attacks.
The air campaign in this war was more effective than it was in the 2006 war. There were a lot of lessons learned. So Israel did effectively go after senior leadership and did effectively degrade a lot of the rocket force that Hezbollah had acquired, had built up. So I would say, while it remains true that air power alone is not sufficient to win a war or to hold territory, obviously, they still have gotten better at it.
Hezbollah had created decoy command posts and fake launch sites, while their real ones were hidden or dug deep 40 meters into the rocky, hilly terrain. There are conflicting reports of how effective the initial bombing campaign actually was. IDF command, they estimate that Hezbollah had 16,000 rockets prior to the war, of which they claim to have destroyed 90% within the first 2 days of aerial bombing. But incoming rocket fire to northern Israel remained at a steady rate of about 100 per day.
So this quote is obviously very relevant. So the conventional army loses if it does not win. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. That is the situation that both Hezbollah and Hamas are in. They're guerrilla fighters. Obviously, Hezbollah is much more coordinated, much better equipped, but they're still a guerrilla force. So they can claim victory, and they have claimed victory after getting battered, after having their arsenal depleted and their leadership almost completely eradicated. They can still claim victory because Israel incurred enough military casualties and enough of an economic cost, points 1 and 2, where they essentially could not achieve their war aims. They could not either conquer the country, which also touches on point 3 about Lebanese sovereignty. They also couldn't occupy it like they have in the past. And they were not able to either completely destroy Hezbollah or meaningfully and permanently degrade them to the point where either diplomatically or militarily to the point where they're no longer a threat. So in a sense, according, if we abide by the logic of this quote, which I do, Hezbollah in a sense is a victor, did achieve something. I mean, and so essentially both sides is sort of a draw, because both sides essentially have achieved some sort of victory. All they have to do is keep going, outlast the IDF in some way for some political objective, right? Whether that's what they claim, which is, solidarity with the people of Palestine, or, a coordinated attack, or with Iran or other proxies, or with Hamas, which is probably mostly lip service, or if it's their own means, their own objectives, against Israel for their own reasons, or whether it's for what they say to protect Lebanon, or at least the Shiite population of Lebanon. All they have to do is stay in the fight, keep going, and outlast Israel's will to whatever their perception is, either to conquer them, to expand, anything, and they win. Essentially, that's how it works for them. So for Israel, they win obviously through these more concrete results, and then for Hezbollah, they literally can just say they successfully resisted yet another Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon.
Overseas tonight, the new U.S. brokered ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah appears to be holding. Thousands of people are now returning to their homes in southern Lebanon. In its first statement since the truce went into effect, Hezbollah is claiming victory. That ceasefire is now raising hopes of a possible end to the fighting in Gaza. Here's ABC's chief international correspondent, James Longman.
Celebration and relief on the streets of Beirut today as the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah begins. The thousands of citizens who fled yesterday's massive bombardments in central Beirut flooded back into the city. And those displaced from southern Lebanon finally returning to what's left of their homes.
We are back on our land. I can't believe it. Oh my God.
We've been in touch with Gia since she evacuated over 2 months ago. Despite the loss, they are determined to rebuild.
It's like, on the one hand, obviously they've suffered through immense civilian casualties, but that it politically serves Hezbollah just the way it politically serves any Palestinian paramilitary or political force. They can say that they survived, and the thing is, once the bad thing happens, once you're displaced from your home is destroyed, your relatives are killed, the ceasefire is relatively a relief. It is essentially, moving in the direction of some relief. It's like things maybe can get better. And so that really elevates Hezbollah's position. Now, what some other people are saying, it's like, well, on the other hand, people blame Hezbollah for bringing Israel's war, the IDF's wrath to Lebanon, because they did attack in what they said was solidarity with Hamas. We're obviously not seeing that, right? We're seeing just relief amongst the civilian population, determination, and essentially a doubling down. And obviously, everybody there's a wide variety of opinions, right? And we're talking Hezbollah's base of support is mostly within the Shiite population of Lebanon. Lebanon's a very diverse society, and I think that their base of support is going to hold. I think there's reasonable amount of evidence to say that they're not going to significantly lose their base of support, in southern Lebanon or in Beirut.
Hezbollah is selling this as a victory, stopping an Israeli occupation, inflicting heavy losses. But Israel says the group has been set back decades. with its leadership decimated during weeks of bombardment and intense military assault. And now its northern residents are getting ready to head home too. Zion saying, we've been waiting for it to end so we can get back.
Yeah, obviously that goes back to the economic situation also. Israel needed their people, their internally displaced people, to be able to return home, you know? And so they can also say that it's a victory, right? The ceasefire allows you to go back home, right? It's relatively better than when the war was in full swing. So, you know, Hezbollah's going to keep going. They already named their new leader, Naim Qassem. And there's no reason to believe, essentially, that this temporary ceasefire isn't going to basically end up like the last one. So what brings us to point number 5, essentially. This is the best that either side could hope to achieve in the near term. So on the Israeli side, the United States was pressuring them, and both administrations, doesn't matter that Trump is coming to office, nobody wants a wider war in the Middle East. Nobody wants Israel to stoke a wider war against Iran. Iran doesn't want that war either. And Hezbollah has been degraded enough where Israel can refocus internally, try to recover its economy, try to recover in a humanitarian sense, deal with enough, actually try to make something happen on the Palestinian front. Whether that is more violence or less, we don't know yet. There could be a annexation of the West Bank. There could be annexation of parts of Gaza. I think there's already a military base in central Gaza. Many people have said that this is a genocidal conflict when it comes to the conflict in Gaza. It could get worse. It could get better. We don't know yet. At least in the Lebanese front, it is essentially staying the way it always has been. And that's the best that either side can do.